Hello and welcome to a second episode of Social Justice Alchemy on this, the 11th of June, 2018. First thing I'd like to talk about today is the Supreme Court's gift to the LGBTQ community. Just in time for Pride Month, the Supreme Court decided not to do anything substantial when it comes to gay rights. Now, that said, they didn't necessarily side with the bigoted baker, but they weren't exactly brave in what they did. The case, for those who don't recall, is about a baker in Colorado. Two women walked into his shop. He asked immediately if they were gay and then kicked them out. Didn't even get a chance to, say, no, I'm not going to bake you a wedding cake. He just kicked them out for being gay. In response, the Colorado Civil Rights Commission told the owner of the Masterpiece Cake Shop that he was a bigoted asshole and not to do that. Now, what the Supreme Court should have done, if they had any sort of courage whatsoever, is they should have said, look, we agree with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. Just because you follow a Bronze Age religion that hates pretty much everyone doesn't mean that you have the right to be an asshole. You want to participate in public society in all sorts of ways, then you have to be a decent person to everyone in public. Instead, in the words of Amanda Marcotte, they punted. Justice Anthony Kennedy has long been considered the swing vote on the court. He's not far-right. He's not even close to a far-right activist like Neil Gorsuch, but he's not far-right like Alito and Thomas. He's also not anywhere close to being left-wing like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or a more liberal center-right sort of person like Sotomayor, or right-center, further right but not quite as far right as Alito, like Roberts. So Kennedy's the one who wrote the decision, and the reason it was a 7-2 decision is because of how narrow it was. It said, basically, that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission decided the right way, but they were too mean in the way they did it, and they sent it back down. In other words, it's not a resounding victory for the bigots, but it's not exactly like the court is standing up for civil rights. The Supreme Court, indeed all federal courts, have come very, very far downhill since the middle of the 20th century. The Warren Court was really the only time we had a Supreme Court that was worth a damn. Warren Court is named after Chief Justice Earl Warren, who presided over the court from 1953 to 1969. And whereas Kennedy is a moral coward who is willing to leave things for the future, hoping that LGBTQ things shift far enough that it will eventually be a popular decision for the court to decide in favor of queer folks, the Warren Court actually decided on these things well in advance of popular support. The Warren Court is the one that decided on civil rights and desegregation. And this was in the mid-1950s. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that the majority of the American population agreed that interracial marriage was okay. So the Warren Court was well ahead of its time on that. Now, it's probably very, very difficult for our Supreme Court to get anything done, as thoroughly divided as it is, but the fact remains that Kennedy should be ashamed of himself. Nevertheless, nevertheless. Screw it, he should be ashamed of himself, regardless of what the Republican Party is doing to the federal justice system. Under Obama, we know that they blocked his appointment of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. What's a little bit less well known is that they blocked the appointment of hundreds of federal judges. They wanted those seats to remain empty until a Republican was in power so that they could get more people like Gorsuch on those benches. The Republican Party is full of shit in so many ways. I want to point out, the Democrats, for all that they are still a center-right party, they don't do that sort of thing. Yes, they're still imperialist, capitalist, and not all that fond of doing the right thing, but at least they don't actively try to do the wrong thing in the way the Republicans do. So, this was not really the victory for the right-wing bigots that they claim it to be, but it sure as hell isn't a victory for gay rights. Not a victory for progress in any way, shape, or form. Before I depart from the subject of the Supreme Court and its cowardice, I strongly recommend you check out the Opening Arguments podcast with Thomas Smith and Andrew Torres. It's a podcast dedicated to discussing current events with a real-life lawyer. That's Andrew Torres. They have just covered this case with Andrew Seidel, a resident lawyer with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It's an excellent podcast. You should listen to it routinely if you don't already. And I've gone ahead and linked this particular episode in the show notes below. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about business. Elon Musk has had a kind of a rough week. A few ups, a few downs. On the downside, he had kind of a meltdown on Twitter, you may recall. People challenged him on some of his nonsense. He has an awful lot of nonsense. People challenged him on his nonsense, the public in general and some journalists. In response, he went on a tirade and he insulted the field of nanotech on Twitter. He also tried to set up an independent commission for analyzing journalists. And in the midst of that, praised, stuff written by a cult. Not too surprising, that last bit. Elon Musk, whether he wanted to or not, whether he intended to or not, has ended up leading a cult himself. It's more like he stumbled into the next version of Scientology, in which he promises all sorts of outlandish, ridiculous things thanks to technology, and people just eat it up because he's rich. Fact is, Elon Musk is an investor, not a visionary. And investors, when you start out rich, you can keep your money without too much effort. You invest a little bit here, a little bit there. Sometimes it pans out and you walk away with a hell of a lot more money. Sometimes it doesn't and you lose a very small amount of money. The way the United States is set up, once you have money, it's really hard to become poor again. And Elon Musk is really just an asshole. Listen to the story his ex-wife tells, an admittedly biased source, but not a whole lot of reason to doubt her. And he is exactly the sort of shithead you would expect to succeed in business. Guy who loves being the alpha, the guy who loves the power to fire people, the guy who just sort of loves power. And the reason I'm willing to believe her on this is because of his actions elsewhere, specifically at his Tesla plants, where he has, possibly illegally, or it should be illegal, done everything he could to prevent a union from forming, while abusing, mistreating his workers, driving them to burnout and to injury. So given his recent Twitter meltdown, it's not surprising that one of the investors wanted to strip him of his role as chief executive officer at Tesla. But he had a good week too, because he survived that attempt. He's still the CEO at Tesla. The reason he survived is probably because he announced that he's going to open a new gigafactory in Shanghai. China has even fewer protections for workers than the United States, so that's probably going to do wonderful things for the price of their stock. It's going to do terrible things for their workers, both here in the U.S. and over in China. Even the threat of opening a plant overseas is enough to drive down wages and strip workers of their protections. Just in case I hadn't made it perfectly clear, fuck Elon Musk. Fuck his ridiculous ideas, and fuck his fanboys for thinking he's some kind of visionary genius. And continuing our downward slide, there have been a couple of celebrity deaths this past week or so. Not just deaths, but possible suicides. The first was fashion designer Kate Spade, who was found dead in her home Tuesday or Wednesday. She hanged herself and was discovered by her housekeeper. And also, last week, we have celebrity chef Anthony Bourdain found dead in his hotel room, also apparently of suicide. I've never followed either the celebrity chef thing or fashion. Neither one of these struck me particularly hard, or at all, really. I'd never heard of either one before this past week. But a number of the people I follow on social media, a number of friends, made it clear that these deaths hit them particularly hard. We have execrable, shitty, awful responses to suicide. Talk about permanent cures of temporary problems. And of course, we have absolutely no support for mental health, at least here in the United States, but in much of the Western world, things could stand to be a lot better. I've seen a few descriptions of what it's like to live with a chronic condition, depression, or anything else. And I'm going to go ahead and link one in the show notes. We need to do better, and linking to suicide hotlines is nowhere near enough. We need to make sure that everyone has consistent access to good health care. Where we are now is not much better than the Dark Ages. We have decent medicine out there, but the overwhelming majority of people just don't have access, and it's simply unacceptable. And now let's move on to something a little bit lighter in our science news segment. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about the overall utility of this one, but people have demonstrated the possible efficacy of just removing CO2 directly from the atmosphere. You might have seen pictures of this floating around, of a setup of a whole bunch of absolutely gigantic fans. And yes, there is something to that. CO2 is soluble in water. It will react with water to make carbonic acid, H2CO3. And then if you have something else dissolved in the water, it's possible to sequester the CO2 and keep dissolving more CO2 into the water. And then you can use the carbon dioxide for other things. You can use it for making fuels, you can use it for making sugar, or you can just permanently sequester it, react it with other chemicals, and transform it into the building blocks of granite or limestone. There are many things you can do with it. Now, they tout this, of course, as a carbon-neutral method for making renewable fossil fuels. The reason I'm skeptical of that is because it's going to take energy to transform, to capture the CO2 from the air, and then to transform it back into fuels. But regardless, I think that as we develop multiple methods, we are going to discover more and better ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, to reduce or even eliminate our reliance on fossil fuels, and sequester CO2 in long-term or even semi-permanent strategies. On the geological scale, nothing's truly permanent. And, in effect, manage, mitigate, perhaps even eliminate some of our harmful effects on the environment. So, yes, a little bit of skepticism might be warranted, but this is overall a good thing. It's a promising step in a good direction. And I think that'll do it for me for this week in social justice. I've been your alchemist, John Brockman. Just like to remind you that I have another podcast out there in which I and some friends are trying to destroy the universe by releasing an ancient evil. That's Dungeons and Debacles at dungeonsanddebacles.com. For those of you listening to this on podcast, I have a YouTube channel on which Social Justice Alchemy also appears, where I practice the guitar almost daily, and in which I have a couple of other projects in development. For those listening to this on YouTube, I also have this on podcast form, available on iTunes. So please like, share, subscribe, leave a review, all the things that help this sort of thing succeed. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.